Good afternoon, everyone. This is Joe Harraka from the law firm Becker, LLC. Welcome to today's webinar. We really appreciate your attendance. As you know, our webinar is entitled Returning to the Workplace under the, in quote, New Normal, close quote, How to Protect Your Company, its employees, and its customers post-COVID-19. I'm going to be serving as your moderator today, and we have a distinguished panel of speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. First, I want to kind of talk about the procedure we'll be following today. We're going to have our panel of speakers speak for approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and then we've allocated about 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. To the extent that you have any questions, there should be a portion of the screen on the webinar that you see below the video of the panelists that you can type in any question that you'd like, and we're going to do our best to address as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. But to the extent we don't get to any of your questions, don't worry about it. We commit to having one of our panelists, whoever's best positioned to answer that particular question, follow up and get back to you in the very near future. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, all of whom are experts in their respective fields, and I'm going to do it in the order that you'll be hearing from them. First, I have the pleasure of introducing one of my colleagues and partners, Chris Leddy. He's with our firm's corporate and trucking and logistics departments. Chris has tremendous experience handling and litigating complex employment law issues, as well as counseling our firm's clients with respect to all aspects of the employment-contractor relationship. Next, we have Michael Friel. Mike is a Senior VP and Regional Sales Manager at Assured Partners. He's been with that firm since 2018. Before that, Mike had over 10 years of experience working as an independent insurance agent. Mike takes great pride in always doing what is in the best interest of his client and leading with integrity. Last but not least, we have Mike Destasio. Mike Destasio is a colleague of Mike Friel at Assured Partners. He's also a Senior VP with that company, and his office in their Cranford, New Jersey location. Mike's highly regarded. I can personally attest to that. I've dealt with him on an extensive basis over the last few years in the transportation industry, and he's well renowned for his knowledge and understanding of insurance regulations and the needs that his clients require. Okay, I'm going to start off with you, Chris. The first question I have for you today is, what's the first step that employers should be taking when planning to reopen their workplace?
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone, for attending. So the first thing you want to do is you want to assess. You want to identify your essential business functions and your essential employees. So who has to be in the office, who doesn't have to be in the office? Can you do it remotely? For instance, a lot of times accounts payable you want in the office because they're constantly invoicing, printing, sending checks. So those type of people would be essential employees. You also want to identify groups and schedules in case you want to do a staggered return to work. What I mean by that is maybe you have a team red and a team blue where you have 20 employees, put 10 in team red, 10 in team blue, and you have them go every other week. So not everybody's there at the same time for the time being. You're also going to want to look at what is your minimum staff you need to keep operations going if you need them in-house. The biggest thing you want to be careful of right now is any kind of person with any kind of comorbidities, any disabilities, anybody who's highly susceptible to contracting COVID. And you're going to want to work with them to give any kind of accommodations that could be made that do not cause an undue hardship. You're going to want to work under the ADA with that, which we'll get into in a little bit. You also want to create a pandemic response team. You want to have a single point of contact so all of your employees know who to go to, who to speak to, and that so you know who to go to and speak to. You're going to have to communicate this very clearly and empathetically. Transparency is going to be key here because you want people reporting to you. You want people telling you they're sick or that they feel other people may be sick, because obviously one person gets sick, it could shut down the entire operation, at least internally. And you're going to want to plan for what ifs. What if a second wave does come about? How are you going to handle that? Are you going to go back to remote working? Is remote working feasible? Maybe getting another separate space set up just in case. These are all things that you have to plan for. And I think that is the first thing you're going to want to consider when bringing everybody back to work.
Chris, I want to follow up on some of that. With social distancing playing such a key theme right now and limiting the spread of the virus, from an insurance standpoint, and we'll definitely work both mics into the discussion shortly, what does the actual physical space of an office now going to look like? I mean, can you address what kind of modifications employers should be making to that physical office space?
Yeah, so a lot of people know many of these already. You're going to want to look at your desks, your workstations, your common areas, drop zones for delivery. You want to have a 6 feet distancing. You want to have any shields. You're going to look for the PPE usage, so the mask, gloves, and you're going to want to train everybody on the usage of the mask, gloves, if you're going to require them, hand sanitizer, hand washing etiquette. You're also going to want to look at entrances. Are you going to have a separate entrance for vendors and a separate entrance for employees? It may make sense to do so. Along those lines, you also may want to stagger the schedules of when people are reporting to work. So if you regularly report to work from 9 to 5, maybe some people you should put on 8:30 to 4:30, then 9 to 5 and 9:30 to 5:30. That way, not everybody's coming in, creating congestion at the beginning of the workday. Where feasible, you're going to look to continue to telework. You want to make sure that there is no physical contact between any employees. Even though you're in the office, you're going to want to try to conduct virtual meetings to the extent possible. If you're going to have in-person meetings, they should be conducted in places where there's maximum circulation. So if you can, if it's a nice day, get outside, sit at a picnic table. You're going to want to wear masks if it's inside, again, 6 feet apart. You want to try to limit interactions to 10 minutes or less. We talked about respiratory etiquette, meaning cover your mouth, disposal of tissues and somebody's own garbage. Do not use somebody else's garbage. Getting hand sanitizer throughout the entire area. You want to close down all common areas, so you probably likely want to close your kitchen and have everybody either eat at the desk or outside the office. You're going to want to post signs reminding everybody to wash their hands and to socially distance themselves. You may even want to go as far as setting hand washing schedules. As far as the bathroom usage, I would recommend one person at a time. You're going to want to display CDC posters in whatever languages that your employees speak. And I think most importantly, you're going to want to stay informed, right? You want to stay informed of any CDC, EEOC, OSHA guidelines that seem to be coming out very frequently these days. So those are really the high level things that you want to do as far as keeping everybody safe.
Thanks, Chris. I know that Mike Destasio is going to talk about some resources when he talks about where people can find out some of that information, particularly from their own carriers or even from their in-house or outside counsel. But I'm sure the participants want to also hear what thoughts or ideas do you have with respect to office cleaning?
Yeah, obviously, when you're cleaning, same goes for the PPE. You want to wear it. Make sure everybody who is cleaning is wearing it. You're gonna want to use, where possible, EPA registered disinfectants for the high touch areas. You're gonna probably want to reduce those. So, for instance, if you have a time clock, likely want to go to electronic timekeeping system where a person punches in on a computer. And if there are time clocks, you want to sanitize after each use. Have hand sanitizing wipes right next to it. Same thing for high use machines like copy machines. After every use, have the person wipe it down. And finally, you want to make sure that you have high quality air filters that can filter out any kind of germs. And you're going to want to work with your landlord to make sure that they're installing such.
Chris, I'd like you to touch upon one of the key areas of this discussion, and that is, how do you go about protecting your employees? Because they're protecting your employees, you're protecting your company from any exposures. And while the two mics will talk to you or talk to us and the participants later on about how to basically navigate those additional exposures, what do we do with respect to employee screening protocols so as to try to start or eliminate any risk at the inception?
Yeah, I think temperature taking has been well publicized. Everybody can take temperatures now at this point due to the pandemic. Again, remember, it's due to the pandemic. If and when the pandemic does end, temperature taking will no longer be permitted. You can also ask self-questionnaires, where employees give you answers to certain set questions. For instance, have you in the past 14 been in contact with anybody who has been infected? Have you traveled to a high risk area, such as maybe New York City? And have you experienced any symptoms that are associated with COVID? You can also have them self-declare as opposed to a questionnaire. Same concept though. You want to make everybody aware of what the symptoms of COVID are. So not only will the person who is experiencing the symptoms, but in case any other employee notices another employee has the symptoms. So obviously those are fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath, fatigue, muscle or body aches, headaches, loss of taste or smell, sore throat, congestion, nausea or vomiting, and diarrhea. Really much like the flu, but obviously a lot more dangerous. And then you're going to have explicit policy not to report to work if they're experiencing any symptoms. I think making everybody very clear and coming down very hard with that is one of the key components of a return to work policy.
Chris, how does this new landscape play into the ADA?
Yeah, so the ADA, obviously, a lot of employers are afraid of any kind of litigation or retaliation based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Fortunately, according to guidance from the EOC, the ADA has been relaxed due to a pandemic. So employers are free to advise employees to go home if they feel there are symptoms. That's not a disability-related action. Also, because COVID-19 is a direct threat, a lot of these are suspended. A direct threat is defined as a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. So somebody with COVID or experiencing COVID-like symptoms, they would be deemed to be a direct threat, where other actions that would otherwise not be permitted are permitted. If they are a direct threat, they're no longer protected by the ADA. You're also permitted to ask employees about symptoms. If somebody calls out, you're always permitted to ask why they're calling out, but now you're allowed to ask about the symptoms as well, as long as they're yes or no questions and directly related to COVID. And like we talked about before, body temperature taking is now permitted.
Chris, what do employers do if an employee tests positive for COVID? You have any thoughts on that for the participants?
Yeah, obviously you have to keep it confidential to the extent possible, right? So you're not gonna tell people who the person is. You're just gonna inform everybody that somebody in the office had tested positive or that an employee had tested positive. You're gonna have to report that to the health agencies in accordance with law. You're probably gonna want to look at, which Mike and Mike probably talk about a little more, a workers' comp claim, just so there's a record of it. And again, you want to make sure not to violate any privacy rights, right? So all these reports are going to go into into the person's personnel file, but you should have a separate personnel medical file where all these are kept totally separate from any kind of personnel I-9s. They should be completely separate. I can't emphasize that enough, because if you ever do get into litigation and it's not about any kind of medically related symptom or action, they ask for a personnel file, it could create problems. So again, have the medical file separate.
Because I'm sure this is an important issue to a lot of the participants out there, and that is, how should employers handle an employee who wants to return positive?
Yep, so obviously they've come out and you want a doctor's note, right? You want a certificate of fitness from coming back to work that they've been free and clear of the virus. Alternatively, the government has recognized that due to the pandemic, which is starting to spike again, doctors may not be available to provide a doctor's note. You may not be able to go to the doctors. So they've given two alternative options for the employees to satisfy to permit them to return to work, that the employee has had no fever for 72 hours, the respiratory symptoms have improved, and at least 10 days have passed since the symptoms have first appeared. So that's option one. Option two is very similar. The only difference is that instead of 10 days have passed, they've received 2 negative tests in a row, at least 24 hours apart, and that the testing doctor has followed CDC guidelines.
Chris, and I'm sure again that the two Marks are going to talk about how to navigate this, but what about potential discrimination claims? What are you seeing or expecting with respect to best practices, how employers should be implementing certain measures to try to minimize and hopefully eliminate those types of claims?
Yeah, obviously there's going to be opportunistic plaintiffs' attorneys out there that are going to look for ADA claims. The best you can do is document everything. I know we attorneys will always tell you to document. We can't tell you enough. I'm going to say it again, document. The problem is going to be is really, I think it's going to be the age factor. So obviously people who are over 60 years old have a higher risk than people who maybe are in their 40s, right? However, age is a protected characteristic under federal law if you're over 40. So there could be a disparate impact, meaning that you're treating one category of protected class better than another category. So are you treating everybody over 40 the same, or are you treating people 40 to 50 different than you're treating people who are 60 to 70? Obviously, 60 to 70, they're more vulnerable to the virus, and common sense hopefully plays out here, at least with the law, but law doesn't always follow common sense, that you would obviously look to see them work from home to the extent possible. You're also going to want to enter into the interactive process, which means engaging the employee, seeing what kind of accommodations can be made. Maybe there's an accommodation that can be made as opposed to them working for work. Because once you open the work from home option, the floodgates do open.
Chris, one last follow-up question before we hear from the two mics on some of the insurance issues is, what about some of the wage and hour pitfalls employers may have with respect to the new normal, so to speak, of the workplace?
Yeah, so really the biggest issue is and has been tracking exempt or non-exempt employees. You want to make sure that you have a set schedule where people are logging in, logging off. You have a set policy telling them that they can only work from, if it's 9 to 5, they can only work 9 to 5. If they're going to work overtime, they have to get express written permission. Otherwise, they're subject to discipline up to and including termination. You still have to pay them if they work the overtime, but you can discipline them. That's the biggest issue going right now. You also want to make sure that for exempt employees who are now working from home, if their exemption status was based on them supervising other employees, if they're no longer supervising employees because they're working from home, they may lose their exemption status and then should be treated as a non-exempt entitled to overtime, and you have to make sure you're tracking their hours as well.
Thanks, Chris. Mike Friel, I'd like to get you involved in the discussion. I think it's a great opportunity and a great segue. I'm sure a lot of the participants want to know, from just an insurance standpoint, from a risk profile standpoint, and even maybe impacting their insurance coverage and their premiums. Can employees be reclassified if their role and job functions have been modified due to a change in their work location? A lot of employees obviously are now working at home.
Sure, absolutely. I will say this with workers' compensation, it's dictated state by state, and where we happen to live, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, they all are independent rating bureaus. There's also the NCCI, which is National Council, which is 36 of the other states. And so what we're noticing and what we're finding is that NCCI seems to be leading the way. And depending on the state, New York, New Jersey are following this similar path of the NCCI. So everything I say is going to be dictated by the particular state. However, what we're seeing is, for the most part, if you are, say, I'm just going to use an example as the best way to describe this. If you're a truck driver, or you may be in the warehouse and you're reclassified from a work from home and or a clerical type position, then yes, you have the ability to do so. However long this may be going on for. They actually determined 12/1 was the effective date and then it's going to run out until, this is behind us. But to Chris's point, documentation is key between attorneys and insurance professionals. That's something that's certainly going to help support you. So as you reclassify, when you have that audit, which happens on every single policy, it's an annual term. Make sure you have that prepared and you have that ready for the auditor.
Thanks, Mike. I'm sure, again, a lot of participants are interested in this. Will workers' compensation claims related to COVID be excluded from a company's experience rating for purposes of their premium calculations? And as a follow-up, what can a company do, if anything, to manage that lost experience rating due to COVID?
Sure. The first thing I'll tell you is that in order to have an experience mod, typically you have to have premiums that are excess of $10,000. And there's other factors if you're an LLC versus corporation, et cetera, which we don't need to get into that right now. But assuming you have an experience mod, and let's say that there is a COVID-related incident, those things will not be factored into your premium moving forward. So just that's very important to know. And if a claim happens today, the way the system works, it won't actually play a factor for 2 years from now.
Mike, given the changes taking place and how companies are required to do business, and again, I'll just describe that as the new normal, which is in the title of our webinar, and how everyone's now, or a majority of workers, are working remotely or virtually. Based on your experience in the industry, what does the future of workers' compensation market look like, in your opinion?
That's the million-dollar question, Joe. And in the short term, I'm going to say that there'll be very limited interruption. A lot of the loss cost factors and loss ratios have already been determined. However, once we're able to properly evaluate, what the impact of this COVID-19 is, I think there will be disruption. I've heard a lot of, Greenberg he's the CEO of Chubb. He's gone out and said that, this is a multi-billion-dollar loss, regardless of business interruption. Between pandemic insurance and workers' compensation, we're still talking several, billions of dollars. In workers' compensation, in a lot of the states, particularly in the metro area, we've seen a 5 to 6% decrease in rates across the board. So I think there will be a recorrection. I just don't think it's going to be within the next year. I think it's going to be maybe 2-3 years down the road when we can properly evaluate the complete impact of this.
Mike, you may have touched upon this, but I just need some clarification. Are COVID-19 related medical complications compensable under workers' compensation coverage? I mean, there obviously is an issue as to where and when and how the worker may have contracted the disease. Could you touch upon that, please?
That's correct. It's, workers' compensation, it's designed to make you whole and bring you back to work. So they want to bring you back to the second before that incident or that claim happened. They want to bring you back to that exact state, right? And with that said, typically workers' comp, it's going to cover occupational diseases that arise out of the course of employment. And ordinary diseases like the common flu are normally excluded from any workers' compensation policy. But with that said, it's going to be case by case. So I'm going to give you a maybe on this. And the reason for it is, to your point, it's hard to pin back exactly where that individual contracted COVID. Was it at the grocery store, the post office, or was it in fact at work, or from another colleague, et cetera? So it's a maybe. But I will tell you these frontline workers that, God bless them. If it wasn't for them, we'd be in a really tough spot. But your nurses and your healthcare workers, your police officers and firemen, and I will say that they have a much easier case to say that, yes, this is considered, this would be compensable under the workers' compensation policy.
Mike, one last point on this, and I'd like you to address, if you could. What could be done if a business's on-site physical operations have been suspended or modified, but it continues to pay employees although they're working from home remotely?
So a lot of the bureaus, they got together and they created something called idle time, which has its own specified class code. And we're asking people to keep a record of that because, again, as I mentioned before, it's not going to be part of the premium. And also, if we're taking someone from a higher class code to a lower class code, like clerical or telecommute, teleworkers, it's going to be substantially less. So that's something I will say, keep a record of that. And those folks that have been reallocated or reclassified to a lower class, a lower standard, or I'm sorry, a lower industry class, if you will, then those are something that's certainly worth taking into consideration.
Thanks. I'm going to pivot back to you, Chris, right before we hear from Mike Destasio. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the FFCRA for our participants. And you can give just a general review about how that's applicable with respect to this transition back to the workplace.
Yep. So obviously, everybody's aware of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that provided for the paid sick leave and extended family medical leave up to 12 weeks. First 2 weeks are covered by the paid sick leave. Second, or the latter 10 weeks are covered by the Family Leave Act. This is good through December 31st of this year. So even though we're all starting to return to work, keep in mind that it goes throughout the year. It also only applies to people or to companies with less than 500 employees or 500 employees or less. And that is judged at the time that the leave is taken. So if you have 505 employees today, you have 499 tomorrow, you're not obligated to provide the leave today, but if the employer requests leave tomorrow when you have 499, you're obligated to provide the leave. The big difference between the two is if you're taking paid sick leave for your own purposes, then the employee is eligible up to $511 per day. Any other reason, it's capped at $200 per day. Under the paid sick leave, you're not allowed to run any other leaves concurrently, meaning you can't force them to use a paid vacation time, paid sick time, or any other state-provided leave. And then you're also going to want to make sure that you document. You have all your documentation in order, which has the employee's name, the date that the leave is requested, the qualifying reason for the leave, any kind of oral or written statement that the employee is unable to work and what the qualified reason is. For leaves related to the paid sick leaves, you're going to have the employees provide the company with the name of the government entity that issued the order. You're also going to have them provide the company with the name of the healthcare provider who advised the employee to self-quarantine. And if the employee is caring for another individual, same concept, get the order, get the healthcare provider's name. For leave to care for a child, you need the name of the son or daughter, the name of the school, place of care, child care that is closed or that's not available, and a representation that no other person suitable to care for the child. We've seen this come up where perhaps a mother lives with a grandmother. The grandmother is the regular caretaker. An employee is trying to take advantage of this, working from home or taking the time off. Come to find out that the grandmother has always been the one who's been the regular caretaker during the day, and the employee is basically committing a fraud. So you want to be mindful of those as well. You want to make sure you get these representations in writing.
Mike Destasio, I want to get you into the discussion. Given the employer legal obligations that Chris has talked about, some newly just implemented, with respect to the ADA, FFCRA, and wage and hourly laws, how can a company best educate itself on how to address these obligations to reduce their risk exposure?
Well, there are a lot of resources out there where employers can educate themselves. There's coronavirus.gov, there's the CDC. Anyone that has an employee practices liability policy has access to the insurance carrier for advice with regard to some of these issues. Now, many of the policies will include ADA coverage. Not everyone, but most will. Many of the policies do not include Fair Labor Standards Act coverage, and they can provide, some will provide defense, very few will provide indemnity for Fair Labor Standards Act claims or wage and hour claims. So I would contact your insurance agent and/or your insurance company should you have direct access via that employee practices policy. Many resources available, and they will give you advice. Many of them will also give you advice from legal counsel.
Mike, after they educate themselves, what's the best way the company could manage their additional risk exposures? Are there any specific insurance coverages they should consider purchasing or adding to their existing coverage? Any thoughts on that for the participant?
Yeah, well, again, if they don't have employee practices liability, it very well can be purchased today. I don't know that many carriers today would give full prior acts coverage, but with it was available before COVID. If there are no known incidents where a carrier would provide prior acts, meaning if an incident happened prior to the effective date of the policy, again, as long as there were no known factors, it could be picked up by that policy. Also going along with employee practices liability is directors and officers liability. Generally, that's pretty inexpensive for the private company with less than 10 or 20 million in annual sales. And what that protects company and/or directors and officers from claims from mismanagement, claims from possible creditors that allege that there was mismanagement and the company is not able to meet its financial obligations, or maybe a mass layoff. Employees can allege mismanagement as well as go to the employee practices coverage. So directors and officers liability would be a good add at this point in time as well.
Mike, I'm sure that on a lot of people's minds, I mean, you just hear in the news now about there's a significant uptick in cases in the South and Southwest. In fact, the respective governors of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut may be imposing shortly the fact that if certain citizens of those states actually come to the tri-state area, they have to basically quarantine themselves for a couple of weeks. And I'm talking about a second wave. And a second wave government ordered shutdown in particular, causing a loss of income and revenue. Is there any insurance coverage that the participants should consider purchasing or adding to their existing coverage profile to protect them from a possible second wave shutdown?
As we've seen, there were many claims that were reported for loss of business income that are generally not part of the coverage. Today, there has to be direct physical loss to trigger business income. There are one or two companies that there are exceptions to. One is a very large international industrial insurer that did offer coverage for pandemic, sublimit. It was underwritten, premium charge for it. And then maybe one or two carriers out there that have proprietary coverages that they wrote for very small business that didn't have a clear exclusion. But in general, there is currently no coverage for business income. Anywhere where there were any ambiguities, those carriers are not willing to entertain any new business or coverage for business income. Currently, there is a bill bouncing in Washington, D.C. Called Friel, which stands for Pandemic Risk Insurance Act. The bill currently floating would put the first 5% of losses up to $700 or $750 billion on the insurance industry for the carriers that wish to participate. The balance would be picked up by the federal government. Now, the numbers we've seen for loss of income were between $400 and $600 billion monthly. So even if this gets passed, even if this becomes law, a second wave really only gives maybe up to 2 months worth of business income coverage. So it's not like it would go the standard 12 months in the event of a loss resulting from direct physical loss.
Mike Friel, I'd like to turn my attention back to you and ask you a few questions about whether your customers are experiencing any increase in cyber attacks since the beginning of the pandemic. Are there any new security risks that are developing and that the participants should be sensitive to? I know I've been seeing a lot of emails from my director of operations here at the firm about this issue, and I'd like you to address it if you could, please.
Sure. Yeah, I will say people talk a lot about cyber liability. We actually call it it's a privacy policy, really, is what it is, because it also includes paper. It's not just what's in cyberland. But what we're discovering is that a lot of these bad actors are using this as an opportunity or a feeding ground to access and compromise systems. So yes, we've seen an increase. Number one is because a lot of people have they're focusing their efforts elsewhere and trying to get their business, either sustain their business or get things up and running again. Number one. The second thing is that, a lot of folks with this work from home, you're relying on your individual, you're relying on your computer networks, if you have to do login or Citrix, things like that, or you're also relying on your home Wi-Fi and your securities on your computers. So this has really been, unfortunately, it's been an opportunity for these folks to really cause a lot of damage with that. And the other thing I want to tell you, or just quickly describe, is that with privacy policies, no one policy is the same. It's non-standard. So whether it's Travelers, Chubb, Hartford, you name it, every policy is going to look a little bit different, and they're all the coverages are going to be called something else. So it's really important to have a professional review this, just to make sure that you're adequately. And I would actually recommend doing this on an annual basis, because things are changing so quickly. These bad actors are finding new ways, and it's kind of scary how creative some of these folks are. So we're constantly having new coverages roll out that need to be addressed. And my recommendation was don't rely on like $100,000 sublimit on your package, because it's going to exclude things like ransomware. You really want a full, robust policy. And like I said, the market, it's changing every day. But unfortunately, so are these bad actors and how they're accessing your system. So it's really important to just be on the lookout and keep your head on a swivel with a lot of this stuff.
Mike, I just want to unpack that, and please just clarify. Does a company need to actually obtain a new policy, or could they add an endorsement to an existing policy in order to obtain that cyber coverage? And I apologize if I'm not using the right term of art, but what's the preferable approach in your experience? Could you kind of clarify that for at least me, and I'm sure perhaps some of the participants?
No, absolutely. No, you're not alone. It's best to have a standalone policy. No different than, as Mike mentioned, with the employment practices liability. You don't want to have like a small, we call them a throw-in coverage. There's a reason why the coverage is built into the premium before, where it's typically very inexpensive. So you want to have your own policy with your own set of limits, because a lot of times you can buy up, several millions of dollars for, coverage A, B, and C. And things like cryptojacking and invoice manipulation, these are all, no one knew what they were 2-3 years ago, and now we're starting to see that's where a lot of the claims are coming in. And historically, 5-7 years ago, the notification expense was the most expensive part of any claim, the most punitive. But what we're seeing now, it's really when you have to bring the forensics in, that's where these claims escalate very quickly. You put forensic in front of anything, cha-ching. It ain't cheap, and it's going to hit your pockets hard. So the good thing is, if you do have a policy in place, I look at your insurance policy really as a backstop. you still have to do everything you can to be proactive, and you can access a lot of these insurance companies have consultants and ways that you can be more proactive, if you will, because it's a very different experience when you have a cyber or privacy claim as opposed to your standard property or liability type claim.
Mike Destasio, I want to wrap up with you our discussions, and you and Mike Friel spoke extensively about insurance coverages and addressing and managing your customers and the participants' risk profiles and exposures under the new normal, the new landscape that we're all finding ourselves operating under. But what have you and Assured been offering your customers and any other businesses with respect to assisting them in handling the business complications caused by the pandemic and that economic dislocation that's arising from the crisis? Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, we, from day one, we had all of our employees working from home, engaged with our customers. I was engaged with many customers. So we reached out to many to see if we needed to adjust exposures, which we did. Some restaurants we insured were totally shut down. So rather than let them cancel their coverage, we reduced the exposures. Several did not have any additional premium to pay because those exposures were greatly reduced. Many of our truck customers, many insurance companies granted an allotment, granted the motor carrier to take vehicles off who were on scheduled policies, to report less than the minimum monthly on a revenue or miles basis. So most of the carriers have worked with our office and their customers to help reduce exposure, to keep them afloat during this unprecedented time. Assured also had a series of town hall webinars. We've also posted notifications on our website and sent email blasts to many of our customers with regard to important information we could share at this time.
I just want to pose one last question to the panelists. The discussion has been very comprehensive. I've done my best to facilitate the discussions, but do any of you have any final thoughts or points that you'd like to make that I may not have addressed by way of my questioning?
No, I think it just goes back to making sure you document, right? I think Mike said it, I said it. Document everything. It's something that happens today, you're not going to remember in 2 years from now, but you can be sued 2 years from now. So
that definitely came through loud and clear from you and the mics, that's for sure, Chris. and from a litigation attorney standpoint, I can definitely emphasize that, because it's definitely helpful when you have contemporaneous written materials that you can turn to as evidencing of what was actually going on at the time, because not only do witnesses' memories cloud over time, but witnesses and plaintiffs can take advantage of the lack of documentation and be opportunistic as to what actually was, in quote, going on, and be creative if those documents aren't there to undermine them and to basically impeach them. And so, again, from a litigation standpoint, and I know I'm only the moderator, but I want to reiterate everything you and the two Mike said with respect to that. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Again, thanks to the participants. We really appreciate your attendance. And thank you again to Mike Destasio, Chris Leddy, and Mike Friel. Again, if anyone has any follow-up questions after digesting this presentation and would like to have them addressed, don't hesitate to shoot me, Chris, or the two Mikes a follow-up email. Thanks again. Have a great day. Stay safe and well, everyone.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.